Well, thanks so much for that very warm and kind introduction, Liz. So I'm very excited to kind of lead a discussion today around this idea of social perspective taking and how the humanities might serve as a vehicle for practicing this really important capacity. But before we go there, I want to tell you a story about Jim. So, Jim is a very interesting guy who progressively, as he was sort of in his teenage years, began to progressively lose his sight, and he's now been completely blind for about 10 years. But nevertheless, incredibly handy around the house. He's recently put up, done all the roofing on a new dormer that they had built, and has these kind of very thoughtful systems for working on all manner of tasks. And so one afternoon, he's all set to do some kind of final finishing touches on the roof, but it turns out it's a fairly stormy day, and so he decides not to work on the roof, wisely, and instead get to a different task that he'd been putting off for reasons that I think will be clear in just a second. The task in question is rats in the basement, and so he has to set up a bunch of these nasty little rat traps. And so he sort of heads down in the basement to begin working on this. And these are, I don't know if anyone has dealt with these things, but they're very unpleasant. And if you misstep in any way, you can lose a digit pretty easily. So anyway, Jim kind of works his way through the basement and sets up all these rat traps along the way, sort of working from kind of where we can see in the foreground all the way back into the corner, setting up at least half a dozen of these rat traps. And just as he's sort of finished setting up the last one in the very corner of the basement, furthest away from the stairs, there's a big crack of thunder and the lights go out instantly. Pitch blackness and half a dozen rat traps between him and the stairs. So if I have told this story properly, not all of you, but at least a few of you will have felt a cringe or a shudder as you imagine being stuck in the darkness with half a dozen rat traps in between you and the stairs. But of course, this is completely inconsequential to Jim, who has set up a system to make this work for him in the darkness regardless. And so hopefully then, the story illustrates one of these kind of big challenges in taking the perspective of other people. Sorry, that was the darkness. So the challenge then, this kind of curious instance of social perspective taking, it kind of illustrates a paradox, I think. So there's a sense in which we're very much hardwired to connect to and relate to and to understand other people, and yet, assuming that at least a few of you had this sort of egocentric urge of like, oh my God, I would hate to be stuck in the far corner of the basement with all these rat traps in between me and the stairs and pitch darkness. So we're hardwired to do it, but we have all these biases. We don't tend to do it that well in many instances. So overcoming this kind of egocentrism tends to be really hard for us in many different instances and occasions. So on the one hand, we're kind of built to do this. On the other hand, it seems like maybe we're built to do this badly. All right, let's shift over to another curious instance of social perspective taking. This one comes from the Silver Blaze Sherlock Holmes story, in which the general gist is that a horse is stolen out of the barn. Among other animals in the barn is a dog. And so Watson says, at some point in the story, "Is there any point to which you wish to draw my attention?" And Holmes says, "To the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime." Watson says, "The dog did nothing in the nighttime." "That," says Holmes, "is the curious incident." So I think a nice illustration of the power of social perspective taking. So Holmes, repeatedly over many, many adventures, systematically is able to sort of do a much better job than the rest of us mere mortals at not falling prey to some of these biases that we have. So In particular, he is able to attend to a whole array of things sort of filter in through his, hit his perceptual screen, and he's able to weight them much better. So we tend to focus on things that move or are loud or, you know, in some way catch our attention, and he gives a much more balanced weighting of things that are part of the situation that would otherwise fade into the background. And so this gives a little bit of a sense of how the power of social perspective taking can be incredibly important to solving, well, in the one sense, sort of mysteries of the Sherlock Holmes varieties. But if we can kind of regulate these biases that we tend to have, can really be a powerful tool to unlocking the mysteries of what is going on inside someone else's mind. All right, so one more curious incident. This time, the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime in bold italic letters. So this is a book by Mark Haddon, which if you're interested in this stuff and haven't read it, I highly recommend. Describes an autistic adolescent, I guess he is, Christopher Boone, and his adventures trying to figure out why the neighbor's dog turns up dead in the middle of his yard. And it's a really poignant illustration of when the wiring goes wrong and we are not able to kind of read other people and figure out what's going on inside their heads and make some of our, you know, very sort of everyday intuitions about people's motivations, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, how hard it is to connect socially with other people, and interacting with them becomes a really scary proposition under these circumstances. So that's kind of the landscape against which I'm going to hope to kind of walk us through a couple thoughts about social perspective taking and the humanities, and how the humanities, I think, really serve as a particularly interesting way to think about practicing this capacity that we have of social perspective taking. So to map this out a little bit further, social connections, and I think we've heard this in kind of various forms throughout the weekend so far, incredibly fundamental for our species. So just as a couple kind of random quick examples, pretty good evidence from neuroscience that particular regions of the brain appear to have evolved just for the goal of interacting with other people. Infants, as soon as they pop out, have some innate capacities to engage in mimicry, which helps connect them with their mothers. If you don't like that end of the life cycle, look at the other end. Pretty good data that your social relationships are at least partially predictive of how long you're going to last on this earth. So if a primary kind of psychological need for us is to connect with other people, to relate to them, you know, what's the oil that kind of lubricates these social interactions? I don't think it's necessarily the only one, but I would argue this capacity of social perspective taking is really a key one. And so, you know, perhaps the easiest way to see this is with the example Mark Haddon gives with this boy, Christopher Boone. When you see that capacity removed or pulled away or really struggle, it's incredibly difficult to connect with others. And so, you know, as the opening kind of couple examples hopefully illustrate, we're kind of pre-programmed to connect with other people. It's one of the most important things we can do, yet we're not necessarily super well equipped to do it. And so this is why I feel like, and obviously part of my bias is coming from a school of education, we need to practice. We need to educate people on how to do this, how to better figure out what's going on inside someone else's mind. And so the pitch I'm going to make is that humanities offer some really unique ways to do this. And you know, as a social scientist, I don't claim to have any great insights to this, and as I will describe in a moment, hopefully this will be much more of a collective conversation. So here's sort of the main aspirations for the talk then. So I'm going to define what the heck I'm talking about by social perspective taking, And that's maybe not so much an aspiration. I think the more aspirational part is that I will pitch a definition that's like not so contentious that we can at least sort of accept it for the next 45 minutes and get to some of the more interesting stuff. The first of the hopefully more interesting stuff is that I'll propose this theory of the social perspective taking process, like what actually happens when we're trying to figure out what's going on inside someone else's head. And this is a work in progress, so I'm very much open to being wrong, to getting all sorts of feedback. That would be great. And then the sort of end of the talk will be to you know, in many ways, I'll just be trying to seed some examples and some illustrations of how I think the humanities can provide some unusual, if not unique, opportunities to practice the fine art of understanding others. So that's the game plan. So let's start out with the kind of definitional piece just to get ourselves all on the same page. So I think a good place to start is to think about social perspective taking as discerning the thoughts and feelings of others. So what is it that motivates other people to do those crazy things that they do? How do we try to figure out how the situation looks to other people? This is all kind of at the core of social perspective taking. So that's a good start to a definition, but I think not quite enough. So there's sort of an ability component to this. And you sort of heard me refer to this as a capacity, and I stay away from the word ability because I think it is both an ability but also a motivation. And so this ability piece, how good are you at reading someone else? So you're 5. How could you possibly understand the problems of a 5-and-a-half-year-old? You know what, if you're 5 years old sitting in a sandbox and you couldn't possibly understand what it's like to be a 5-and-a-half-year-old sitting and playing in that same sandbox, the psychological experience is so different, you know this is tough stuff that we're getting into here. So, so there's the ability piece, but then, oh my God, it gets worse. There's this motivational piece. So the guy walks in to find his wife in bed with someone else. He says, I know what you're the wife says, I know what you're thinking, but let me offer a competing narrative. So I love this cartoon because the wife actually, I think, engages in some phenomenal perspective taking. She somehow figures out that the husband is not going to be in the optimal position to take her perspective, and so very kindly, she offers a competing narrative. So again, you know, I think one of the big barriers we have to engaging in this perspective-taking process is this motivational piece. And so, you know, there have been scholars to study sort of both of those pieces of the puzzle. All right. So there's sort of our baseline definition. I want to do maybe just a little bit more on this, which is kind of bounding and talking, just to kind of lay out a little bit more of what I'm talking about and what I'm not talking about. So whose perspective is a big one here, I think. And so I sort of pull on a grammatical analogy, and given the number of people I imagine who are English majors in the room, I thought you'd really appreciate this. I know there are at least a couple Southerners here, so mine, yours, his, hers, ours, y'all's, and theirs. I feel like some people will resonate with that. So we take the perspective of all these various groups at different times, right? Someone we're interacting with at the moment, someone we're either thinking about or observing afar. Our collective group, right? Mark is probably in the back of the room trying to think, like, what's the pulse of the whole group? Because I know I got to kind of bring everyone together tomorrow morning. You know, an out group would be the y'alls. And there's some group that you are not necessarily interacting with. In many ways, I think one of the most interesting ones is trying to take our own perspective. And we do that all the time, trying to figure out, oh, so if I make decision A over decision B, is that going to make me happy? Will I regret that later? So we actually engage in a lot of taking our own perspective, and great social psychological work in illustrating how bad we are at doing that in many, many instances. All right, so what else? When social perspective taking occurs, so, you know, if my first grammatical analogy wasn't bad enough, I'm gonna give you verb tenses next. So past, present, future. We will often ruminate about why a person behaved in the way they did. You know, how this joke that I'm in the process of telling, how is it landing? Oh my God, I'm checking out facial expressions. Is it working? Is it not working? Right, so we do this constantly when we're interacting with people. And then I actually just alluded to the future, sort of if I make a certain decision, will that make me happy, unhappy, regretful, and so forth. There's an active, effortful, conscious kind of perspective taking that we engage in, which is putting into conscious thought, geez, I wonder what so-and-so is thinking. I wonder how they're feeling. For those of you that are teachers, like, Johnny's staring out the window yet again. I wonder if he is in deep, rapturous thought about that profound insight that I just gave, or if he's spaced out again. There's also, by contrast, a much more sort of automated kind of perspective taking that happens without, I think, really even registering on our consciousness, in which some stimulus impinges upon us. Gosh, that guy who just walked past me was smiling from ear to ear. I wonder if he just won the lottery or something. Seemed right. So I was never intending to take his perspective, but suddenly the stimulus kind of popped into my head, and it seemed like something was going on there, and I drew some inference. The target can be present, right? The person whose perspective we're trying to take could be right there in front of us, or, you know, off in some other room in some past life, and we're just ruminating on that person. And then finally, I think there's an interpersonal kind of perspective taking that we engage in all the time, trying to read those who are in our social environment, as well as a more sort of academic kind of social perspective taking, which is thinking about historical figures, or as got brought up in the talk yesterday, someone suggested that doing character analysis and trying to take characters' perspective in English classes might be a neat thing for students to try and work on. So, you know, real, current, present people, as well as potentially fictional or past historical kind of figures. All right, so far so good. Let's talk about what I'm not talking about then. Trying to bound this and make sure it's a little bit limited, there is a hot button term called empathy, which you may have heard of. And so many different definitions for empathy, most of which entail some sort of emotional matching, right? So if I'm going to empathize with you, I take on some emotional state that either mirrors or parallels or duplicates your emotional state. And I feel like social perspective taking is sort of agnostic as to the emotional state I put on when I am trying to read you. It is more about cognitive understanding of what kinds of emotions you're experiencing. And here's why I think that's important and valuable, at least in my context for trying to do this stuff in schools and in educational context. So you behold a not too happy, in fact, pretty angry 3-year-old boy in front of you, one who I happen to be relatively well acquainted with. And so if I match his emotional state of being really ticked off, I can promise you, because I've done this before, it's not going to go well. Nothing good is going to come out of this. But if I stay a little bit more emotionally neutral, I just try and cognitively figure out he's angry, then I'm probably in a better position to sort of problem solve and figure out what's the best way to, you know, remove the ferocious face. All right, so we're not talking about empathy. There's also this idea of sort of, I don't know if reflexive mimicry is quite the right way to put it, the obviously somewhat contentious but mirror neuron system, so that urge we have to, in some ways, subconscious urge as we're, you know, watching the U.S. women's national soccer team, engaged in a very close match and we see the ball go off to the left, and as the goalie we feel some sort of impulse to sort of dive left with that. This is also not what I am talking about. It is a very important system, it's interesting, but it is not trying to understand what is going on in the heads of other people. And then there's, in some ways, where I think much of this research started, the Piagetian 3 mountain task. This is about visual perspective taking, right? So in the photograph, you see the child who can see certain things and other things are obscured by the mountain, and the research assistant is sort of asking him, you know, what could a doll sitting in this spot or that spot actually be able to see, and what would things look like? So it is much more about objects and about social interaction. So let me actually pause there. Any questions? Is this making sense? Irrevocable doubts that we can't move forward without addressing? All right. So let's dive into this perspective-taking process that I have thought a lot about, but I'm quite sure I haven't gotten totally right. And so let's explore the idea and see what you guys think. So how does this start? How do we actually engage in this process of perceiving someone else? Hopefully, a relatively non-controversial first step in this process is that there has to be a target of some sort in mind. So this might be visual, right? You might see someone else and you're like, oh, I wonder what they're thinking. Could be auditory, right? You could start a phone conversation with someone. You might get an email from someone and start thinking about them. Your mind might suddenly start to wander, and some colleague who, you know, gave you a strange look 2 weeks ago suddenly pops into your head. So this is kind of step one. You perceive a target. Then I feel like we engage in a motivational process, and it's almost like we've got this kind of tippy scale, and we need to like have enough weight to, perspective taking is hard work. We got to have enough weight and value of taking the perspective of this person to overcome the cognitive inertia of just hanging out and not worrying about that complicated other mind. And so if there is a sufficient amount of motivation, then we'll sort of engage in the process, we'll keep going. Also, I think reasonable to bear in mind that at any given moment, the motivational scale could tip, the balance could tip, and we could kind of cut off the social perspective taking effort, right? So I might become overcome with emotion and too ticked off, and I might stop trying to take the other person's perspective. I might decide it's too hard, and I can't do it, and so I'm giving up. So lots of ways in which the process could kind of get cut off at this stage in the process. So a couple other things on motivation. So what actually motivates us to try and take the perspective of other people? There's not a comprehensive list by any means, but a high-stakes target, right? Someone we really care about, who's important to us. Social influence. We spend a lot of our time trying to influence other people in all sorts of ways. My God, I'm trying to convince you that the stuff I'm talking about is actually important. Huge social influence there, or maybe not, I don't know, we'll find out later. Intrinsic interest. Some people are just really fascinated by trying to figure out what's going on inside someone else's head. So all these things tend to bolster, on average, your motivation to read other people. On the other hand, there are things like cognitive load, like I just have so much going on in my head, or some weirdo psychologist has told me to count backwards by sevens starting from 200. And so you've got too much other stuff going on in your mind, you're less likely to put much effort into reading other people. Hubris. Totally know what that person's thinking already. I've been in situations like that all the time. I get it, right? So this is another factor that tends to diminish our motivation to read other people. And then there's some factors like familiarity, right? I know this person really well. And so in some instances, maybe that's a positive motivating factor. We're going to try that much harder. In other instances, you know, it's my kid's sister. They're always going to be my sister. No big deal, I'm not gonna worry about it, I get them. All right, so we've perceived a target, we've gotten motivated, let's assume the scales tip in the right direction, we're actually gonna try and read them and take their perspective. Then we get to a point of sort of like, how am I gonna do this? There are a lot of different strategic approaches that we might take. And so on the one hand, I think there's a set of information gathering approaches that we tend to take. And then there's also a set of inferences that we might try and make. And there are sort of different strategic processes for both. And so if I'm trying to gather more information, of course, the most obvious strategy is I could ask you, did I do something to offend you, right? And that is one way we gather information about what's going on with someone else's perspective. We can also do things like regulate our attention, right? So I am gonna, really zero in and focus on someone's facial expression of emotion right now because I'm worried they're not paying attention, or the furrowed eyebrows, I can't quite tell if they're concentrating or maybe upset with something I just said, right? So we can kind of regulate, focus our attention. This was an interesting one that came up in this particular study I did, this idea of increasing your sort of visual or auditory channels. So a handful of the participants in this particular study noted times when they said, you know what, let's not have a phone call, let's actually meet for coffee and talk through it that way. And so this is a way to gather more information about someone else's perspective because you're getting more channels of communication, right? If you can see someone face to face as opposed to doing a phone call, you're gonna get probably higher quality tone of voice, you're gonna get gestures, you're gonna get postures. So that's a good strategy for getting more information. Once I have collected some of this information, or really probably more accurately simultaneous to the collecting of this information, I will then engage in some different strategies to make inferences. And again, not a full list by any means. The two citations below have a sort of more complete list of these things. But projection, possibly our most common strategy, right? I'm going to project myself into your shoes, and if I were in that situation, here's how I would feel, here's what I would do, here's what would be motivating me. And if I'm a little bit better at this strategy, then I might make some adjustments or do some discounting and say, well, that's what I would do, but I know we're different in some of these ways, and so maybe how you're actually feeling is a little more like this than like that. Typically, when we engage in this sort of anchoring and adjusting process, we do not adjust nearly enough. So none of these are necessarily great or certainly not perfect strategies, but projection is a really common one. Stereotyping, here's what, I think most people who just got dumped and got in a car wreck that afternoon would probably be feeling or thinking, and it would not be pretty. Another really common strategy was a sort of, actually kind of a whole family of compare and contrast strategies. So the most obvious example was, geez, this person, every time I meet them, they're really happy, and suddenly today, not so happy. I wonder what was going on. This is, leads me to a whole array of possible things I might think that, ideas I might come up with for what's going on with that person. Reflection, and so sometimes this can be sitting off by ourselves, kind of thinking through, recounting all the evidence, and thinking what was actually going on with the person. Other times, and this I think is really one of the more productive ways we can engage in this process, is to debrief with someone else. Geez, when we had that couple over for dinner, do you think the husband was acting a little weird? Was something up there? So I think this is a frequent, certainly not always, but a frequent part of the process. All right, so we've perceived our target, we've gotten motivated, we've engaged in this sort of back and forth between information gathering and making inferences, and then this is sort of cyclical in with evaluating like, oh, yeah, I think I get what's going on in this person's head, or still not so sure, I need to maybe rework, get a little more information. Maybe I can kind of review some of the evidence again, make some different inferences. And so somewhat of a cyclical process. And so that's sort of part one. Now part two of the process, if we sort of imagine what's up on the screen as kind of the basic baseline, then we need to overlay this whole thing with a little haze, right? So we're all very biased, and bias can sort of interrupt this process at any step along the way. So in the perception part, perceiving a target, we know from studies about things like police lineups that at a perceptual level, we're actually better at sort of identifying, distinguishing nuance with people of our own race than from a different race. So right out of the gate, some different possibilities going on there. In terms of perspective-taking motivation, there's been some research on sort of employers and employees. So you might be a much more motivated perspective taker if it is your boss than, say, if it is, you know, an undergraduate. So motivation can really, you know, become sort of biased up or down depending on a handful of factors. In terms of strategic approaches, this is probably where more of the bias work comes in. So something like confirmation bias is this idea that we disproportionately are likely to go out and do this information gathering on stuff we think is going to support our pet theory. Because who doesn't like to be right with their pet theories? On the inference side of the equation, the fundamental attribution error is this idea that we disproportionately sort of pay attention to and weight that people do things because they are that kind of person, as opposed to, well, geez, anyone in that situation probably would have ended up behaving in that same way. So, and then maybe one final bias for us on the evaluation front. Everyone has a favorite bias, mine personally, naive realism. This view that, you know, we see the world as it really is, and it turns out anyone who sees the world in the same way, they're right. They agree with us, they're right. If they don't agree with us, odds are it's because they're biased, they're working off different information, and by different I really mean probably not that accurate, probably incomplete. And so we have all these ways of thinking that our worldview is sort of the right one. We perceive things in the right way, and anyone who doesn't share that view is wrong. It's pretty rare that we walk around thinking like, I wonder if I'm the one who's like missing some information here. So anyway, all that to say that in this perspective-taking bias, there's a lot of ways in which we can get derailed. In the perspective-taking process, there are a lot of ways in which bias can derail us. So the next big thing that I want to add into the picture here then is time. So there's a sense in which I have just laid out sort of what might happen for one perspective-taking episode that might last all of 2 or 3 seconds as you make some quick inference about someone else. But if we repeat this over and over and over again, hundreds of times a day for weeks and years as we get older and older and more cognitively sophisticated. I like to think we're all getting more cognitively sophisticated as we get older and older. It's almost like a developmental theory of how we sort of get better with practice. And I say almost because there's one really big thing I think is missing here, and that's feedback. And I've kind of done this deliberately because if we think about the hundreds of times we try to read or make inferences about someone else every day, how many of those do we actually get feedback on? Almost none. It certainly happens once in a while, but it's pretty rare. So I think we have kind of arrived at the, you know, hopefully the crux of the talk then. So we have all these opportunities to engage in perspective taking. We get very little feedback. And this is where I think being able to practice this capacity comes in and is really, really important. And so I'd like to then shift our attention to this idea of what does the humanities offer in terms of opportunities to practice, as in practice reading other people. And so I'm going to kind of seed some examples. This is probably the most awkward moment of the talk for me because as a social scientist, and according to my mother, a particularly uncultured one, I'm going to be probably in the worst position of anyone in the room to come up with examples, but I'm going to try. And so I will keep this kind of short and sweet to minimize the egregious nature of some of these, but talk a little bit about literature, about theater, and about history. And then I think we're in pretty good shape to be able to actually have some good group conversation towards the end. So, all right, here we go. I'll try literature first. So I think one thing that we get out of literature in terms of sort of opportunities to practice social perspective taking, and I hope this sort of builds on some of the nice ideas Keith laid out yesterday, we have direct insight into the minds of characters in, not all books, but many books, and can see this connection between their cognitions, what they're thinking, and how they actually behave. And so of the very few books that I've read, one of my favorites is Catch-22. And if you think about the main character in that book, Yossarian, if you culled out all of his thoughts out of that book, he's just crazy. Like, he does weird and crazy stuff. There's no way to make any sense out of him. And it is only because we have access to his thoughts, which admittedly a bit eccentric, but he's a pretty thoughtful critic of World War II. And he's a complicated guy, and you begin to see, or at least I felt like I began to see, how even though I could get and agree with a bunch of his thoughts, they translated into very different actions for him than they would have for me. And so literature, I think, gives us this opportunity to see how similar thinking can lead to very different actions for different people, which I feel like is an important lesson to extract from this process of trying to figure out other people. All right, a second possibility. A lot of authors will provide this sort of, at least for a bit, omniscient point of view for readers. So, right, we can kind of dive into characters, but then the narrator comes in and gives us a bit more information. Or there's a couple different characters, and we can see how their misunderstandings might arise. And so this seems like really good training for our own misunderstandings, right? So it sort of teaches us to play detective in our interactions with other people as opposed to just judging them, because we can get practice at seeing that there is this broader part of the story. So when we're reading Harry Potter, we can say, oh God, if he would just realize that Ron and Hermione were not writing him all summer because they weren't allowed to, he would just behave so much better. And so by getting a little bit more of the full sets of perspectives, I think it teaches us that there is a little bit more information out there that we could be accessing, and hopefully gives us maybe just a little bit of a nudge to withhold judgment a bit more frequently. So then finally, to sort of cultivate an understanding of the situation of the actors that we read about. So Tobias Wolff has this, couple of books about his upbringing, and he is a huge troublemaker when he gets into these prep schools that he attends, and if I recall correctly, he gets kicked out of a few of them, so there's a little series of them. But because we have read about his whole background and how unstable his family life is and how horrible his father is, it makes much more sense how and why he's behaving in this way. And so I think literature can also teach us a sort of greater appreciation of the role of situation in causing people to act, think, and behave in the ways that they do. All right, so intrepidly we'll forge ahead into theater next. So I think a unique aspect of theater, and was actually really intrigued by the comments yesterday about how Japanese theater differs from more Western styled. But at least in the sort of Western approach to theater, we have this opportunity, which I think is fairly rare in real life, to sit back and be a fly on the wall and just focus on what is going on with these characters that we see up on stage. So, we've paid good money for this. We can just sit down and focus on nothing but the thoughts, feelings, and emotions of a couple different people. Whereas in real life, we tend to have to actually interact with the people, or there's other stuff going on, there's a lot more distractions, and so it's sort of a focused opportunity for practice. Second one is fairly straightforward. Reading facial expressions of emotion, reading gestures, tone of voice. I think one of the things that's so neat about theater is a lot of these emotions that we would otherwise hide from public view become, you know, very much apparent and put forth for everyone to view and see. So once we get into the sort of question and answer, when someone asks me a really mean, hard question and I burst into tears, I'm not going to do it this way. I'm going to kind of recoil into my little corner and do it. And so it's going to be harder for you to get a sense of and a read in this real world situation of what, you know, shame and sadness look like. But on stage, if I were an actor, I would be showing that off to you in perhaps somewhat exaggerated but very open sorts of ways. So I feel like theater offers a fairly unique way to kind of get some practice at reading facial expressions of emotion. Finally, it is this really, you know, kind of live action multimodal opportunity to see social influence and its consequences. So oftentimes I think we have interactions and assume that there are certain social consequences of those interactions. Certainly teaching is a great example. Like, I have taught the class all this stuff. I assume that they know it. Maybe a little bit, not all of it. But in theater, on stage, you actually get to see the consequences of those attempts at social influence playing out as certain characters try to push, nudge, cajole, seduce, etc., other characters in the play. All right. Then finally, and I realize that this is, of course, somewhat contentious to put history down as within the humanities category. Just pretend for a minute if you object to this. So one thing I think history does that is kind of unique is this focus on understanding the role of culture and how that shapes thoughts, behaviors, actions, and points of view. So, for example, if you happen to be curious about why several hundred years ago we engaged in this practice of binding up women and throwing them in the water to see if they would float, at which point you would of course know that they were a witch and should be burned at the stake, or if they instead sank, at which point you'd feel really badly that they weren't a witch. And you know, so it's a pretty weird practice. But if you knew the bit more about the culture of the times, this becomes, I don't know about completely understandable, but at least more understandable, and these sorts of actions and traditions make more sense. And I feel like history gives us a fairly unique vantage point to get a sense of how people's sort of background culture plays a role in their behaviors, beliefs, and actions. Learning how our perspectives change over time. So once upon a time, we thought this idea of the enlightened monarch was really enlightened. Now, maybe not so much. And so through the study of history, we can actually see how with more evidence, people change their minds and begin to hold different vantage points and points of view. And this seems like a very important practice, this idea of seeing how evidence implicates people's beliefs and shifts and nudges how their attitudes might change over time. And then finally, historiography, this sort of study of history changing over time, seems like a really neat example or opportunity to sort of do some synthetic perspective taking. So if you cobble together multiple perspectives from over the years, you know, we might actually come up with some syntheses that are more useful, increase understanding in certain ways. And so this opportunity to aggregate across many different perspectives to get some new insights. There's actually some kind of neat research that shows aggregating across many people's opinions tends to get us better social insights. All right, so you don't need to tell me how badly I've butchered my sense of the humanities. But I would love to sort of kick us off with a discussion now, and I have seeded a couple questions here, which I'll just say a couple words about, but don't feel at all constrained by these. I'm happy for this conversation to go in any direction. So if you want to talk about the perspective-taking process, questions you have with it, things I've omitted, points of confusion, that would be certainly fair game. I thought about sort of asking the general question of like, so do you buy this argument that the humanities offer this neat opportunity for perspective taking? And I finally decided that in trying to take your perspective, probably no one was going to be rude enough to say like, nah, I think it's crap. So I'm going to ask you a tougher question, which is what are the least compelling parts of this argument that a real opportunity in the humanities is to practice perspective taking, like play devil's advocate there. And then finally, you know, from my very limited view of, or limited understanding of the humanities, I came up with a handful of examples. I think there are a ton more opportunities that I've missed in terms of how perspective taking in different branches of the humanities might facilitate the practice and development of this important capacity. So again, don't be constrained by those. What's on people's